wild horses are returning to the steppes of Kazakhstan for the first time in 200 years. It's part of an ambitious scheme to return them to their original habitats.
Once thought wiped from existence, ancient spirits of the wild, these extinct horses were nothing more than fossils and fading stories. But in an unprecedented move that stunned conservationists, China released a herd of them into the harsh, sun-scorched expanse of the Gobi Desert. With no fences, no feeders, and no second chances, their survival was anything but guaranteed. Scientists warned of disaster. Locals watched in awe. Then something happened, something no one could explain. What unfolded next would challenge extinction itself and leave biologists questioning the very rules of nature. Let's dig deep. A wild gamble. In the windswept sands of Jimsar. In the waning light of 1969, a Mongolian border patrol officer scanned the vast, empty plains. His eyes caught a sudden motion. A lone stallion, dust swirling around its hooves, disappearing into the golden steppe. It lasted just a few seconds. But that fleeting glimpse would go down in history as the last confirmed sighting of a truly wild Przewalski's horse, also known locally as the Taki or spirit horse. No one knew it then, but the centuries-old connection between these powerful untamed animals and the Central Asian landscape had all but vanished, quietly, almost without notice. These were no ordinary horses. For thousands of years, they roamed the Mongolian and Chinese steppes, never fully tamed, never truly controlled. They lived with a wildness that made them sacred to local cultures, deeply woven into myths and traditions. But by the late 1800s, the world had changed. In 1879, a Russian explorer named Nikolai Przewalski sent a skull and hide of this unknown wild horse to the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences. This act, simple, scientific, turned the living legends of the steppe into labeled specimens behind glass. Curiosity grew, but with it came captivity. By the 1920s, Taki horses had become zoo exhibits across Europe. Their homeland was shrinking. Human expansion, water drilling, and political turmoil in Mongolia and northern China tore apart the open landscapes the horses once knew. Hunting accelerated their decline. Eventually, the last wild Taki vanished from nature, extinct in the wild. All that remained were a few scattered survivors in zoos, locked behind bars, surrounded by concrete and steel. The bloodline was nearly lost. Only 12 genetically unique horses remained, just 5 stallions and 7 mares. It could have ended there, but instead, something extraordinary unfolded. In 1959, zoos across the globe did something rare in the world of wildlife conservation. They worked together. They created the International Stud Book, not as a formality, but as a lifeline. No zoo was allowed to dominate or isolate its stock. Breeding was strictly coordinated. Horses were sent across borders, across continents, to ensure genetic mixing. Cargo planes carried them like living treasure, each pairing chosen with surgical precision. By 1980, more than 1,000 Przewalski's horses lived in captivity. They were no longer on the brink, but still far from free. Then came China's bold plan. In 1985, the Ministry of Forestry made a daring decision to bring the spirit horses back to the land of their ancestors. The site they chose wasn't a lush valley or a protected park. It was a raw, rugged stretch of desert in Jimsar County, in the Xinjiang region, 4 square kilometers of open, wind-blown scrubland. It was tough. It was untamed. And that's exactly why it was perfect. Between the mid-1980s and early 2000, 24 Przewalski's horses arrived in Jimsar, flown in from zoos in Germany, the UK, and the United States. They didn't travel in luxury. Each horse was tucked into padded stalls inside giant Russian Ilyushin 76 cargo planes. Layovers in Novosibirsk saw crews misting them with water to keep them cool. When they landed in China, the real challenge began. For 30 days, each horse was quarantined. Vets screened for every known disease. No hand-feeding was allowed. Staff scattered desert grasses like feathergrass and drought-tolerant shrubs to train their stomachs. Wolf scat was sprinkled along the fences, not as a threat, but as a test. An ancient whisper to reawaken survival instincts buried under generations of captivity. Behind the scenes, geneticists watched anxiously. Thanks to rigorous planning and emerging DNA techniques, something stunning happened. The herd in Jimsar preserved over 95% of the known genetic diversity of their wild ancestors, a remarkable outcome, considering how close to extinction they had come. But survival was only half the battle. These horses didn't just need protection. They needed to remember what it meant to be wild. Then, in 2001, China took a step no one thought possible. But what unfolded next left even the most experienced biologists stunned. Could nature do this? Keep watching to find out. How China engineered a wild comeback. Keeping a single horse alive is relatively simple. Give it food, water, shelter, and space to roam. But preserving the future of an entire species, that's a far more complicated mission. Especially when every Przewalski's horse alive today descends from just 12 original ancestors. That kind of genetic bottleneck leaves almost no room for error. One misstep in breeding could undo decades of work. So, in Jimsar, China didn't just build a horse farm, they built a living gene bank. One powered not by code and cold storage, but by muscle, instinct, and design that echoes nature itself. The layout is remarkably clever. At the center is the main breeding facility, surrounded by 4 satellite pastures arranged like the points on a compass. In each of these pastures, a single stallion lives with 6 to 8 unrelated mares. This setup sounds traditional, until spring rolls around. Every year, the entire arrangement changes. Horses are sedated, gently lifted onto flatbed trucks, and rotated clockwise to the next pasture. This annual reshuffling keeps bloodlines from getting too close and mimics natural patterns, where young mares would eventually leave their family group to join another herd. It's a genetic strategy disguised as routine horse management. Behind the scenes, a much quieter force is at work. Advanced software monitors every step of this delicate dance. The moment a foal is born, a sample from its umbilical cord is collected and uploaded into a national DNA database. This system doesn't just store information, it analyzes it. Using genetic maps that stretch all the way back to the 1959 International Stud Book, the program scans for potential problems. Any risky pairings, marked by overlapping genes, light up red. Green means a healthy match. Some breeders jokingly call it horse Tinder, complete with photos of stallions and diversity scores. But this matchmaking is no laughing matter. Since the software was introduced in 2015, the inbreeding rate has dropped dramatically, from 0.1125 to below 0.08. That's a 40% decrease, a massive leap forward in conservation genetics. But genes are only part of the picture. These horses may look wild, but many were born in captivity, safe from predators, removed from danger. The desert, however, doesn't care about bloodlines. So, training begins early. Caretakers wear plain clothing, avoid speaking, and make no eye contact. They want the horses to rely on their instincts, not human interaction. Twice a month, muzzled wolves are led along the fences while trainers watch how the herd reacts. At first, their panic is obvious. Wide eyes, galloping hooves, tense stillness. But over time, their reactions shift. They recover quicker. They stop freezing. They're learning. Still, all this takes more than effort. It takes funding. Moving one horse from Europe to Xinjiang costs nearly 800,000 yuan, over hundreds of thousands of dollars. To raise money, the project shares short video clips. Young foals sprinting through sandy dunes, wind catching their manes, accompanied by gentle music. The public loves it. So do sponsors. A major dairy company even printed Przewalski horse heads on yogurt lids and covered the genome sequencing costs in return. Then, in 2020, the project reached a turning point. 3 genetically valuable stallions arrived from Berlin. The final insurance papers were signed. Project leader Gao Ying looked on and whispered just 2 words. It's done. With strong numbers, healthy genetics, and horses now conditioned for the challenges of the wild, the next step was clear. Within days, 30 young horses were loaded and released into the open desert. The gene bank had come alive. It didn't just store a species' future, it gave it breath, muscle, and memory. Now, what drove a nearly extinct species into one of the world's toughest landscapes? Stay tuned to uncover the answer. Where survival is the only teacher. If you were trying to bring a species back from the edge of extinction, would you drop it into a place where summer temperatures roast the earth at 40 degrees Celsius, winters plunge below -50 degrees Celsius, and annual rainfall might not even fill a coffee cup? In 2012, Chinese scientists did exactly that. They chose Kalamaili Nature Reserve, a harsh, unforgiving corner of the Dzungarian Gobi in Xinjiang, not despite its brutal extremes, but because of them. Why pick such a place? Because survival here doesn't come from handouts. It can't. In this landscape, an animal must remember how to be wild. There are no fences, no feeding stations, no second chances, just wind, dust, and the instincts of a creature that once ruled these plains. Kalamaili's terrain is tough, but water, or the lack of it, is the real trial. In a good year, snowmelt creates small puddles scattered across the reserve. But in drought years, those puddles dry up, leaving behind shallow seeps, some no larger than a volleyball court. According to a 2022 Camera Trap survey, only 42 dependable watering spots exist in the entire 50,000 square kilometer area. That's fewer than one water source every 1,000 square kilometers, well below what most hoofed animals require to survive. So, how did the reintroduced Przewalski's horses manage? They weren't alone. Kalamaili is already home to about 6,000 Kulan, Mongolian wild asses that are faster, tougher, and more desert-savvy than the recently rewilded horses. Scientists feared competition. In a dry land with little water, fights were expected. But something remarkable happened. Infrared footage revealed an unexpected behavior. The horses waited. They allowed the Kulan to drink first. This quiet agreement wasn't programmed or taught. It evolved naturally, an unspoken rule that prevented fights and injuries. For animals that had lived behind fences for generations, this moment of cooperation marked a significant shift. It wasn't just survival, it was adaptation. But the desert wasn't finished testing them. A 2021 drone survey revealed another presence: wolves. 14 of them, patrolling the vast reserve in coordinated packs. These weren't animals from captivity. They were apex predators, and their targets weren't the mare-protected herds, but lone stallions, the bachelors without protection. In the first winter alone, rangers recorded 3 kills. Harsh? Yes. But ecologists saw something more. These weren't random attacks. They mirrored the predator-prey patterns observed in fully wild populations across Mongolia. It was balance, not chaos. Even the plants had something to say. Botanists monitored grazing areas and were surprised by what they found. Light grazing by the horses actually improved the land. Roots grew deeper, anchoring the soil better. Staple grasses like stipa began to send out new shoots, strengthening their hold against the desert winds. In contrast, fenced-off zones that weren't grazed saw biodiversity shrink as aggressive shrubs took over. It turns out that the very presence of wild horses helped the desert stay alive. But this hard-earned harmony now faces a new threat. Climate change projections warn that by 2050, Kalamali's ability to support life could drop by 15%. Rising temperatures and shifting weather could tip the balance once more. Scientists are already preparing. They're mapping new migration paths, cooler, wetter corridors hidden along the eastern mountains. New lightweight GPS collars will let horses show researchers in real time where they can survive. Because in this desert, survival isn't given, it's earned. But what did they face? How did they adapt and how did they survive? You won't want to miss the full story. The day the desert welcomed its lost horses. On the morning of August 27, 2001, the wind stood still over the vast stretches of the Kalamali Nature Reserve in China's remote northwestern Xinjiang region. The sky was clear, the landscape quiet. Too quiet, almost, like nature itself was holding its breath. To most, it might have seemed like just another calm day in the desert. But behind a wire fence, history was lined up in flesh, bone, and breath. 27 Przewalski's horses, 11 mares, 9 stallions, and 7 foals stood poised at the edge of something they had never experienced before. Freedom. Raised in captivity, watched over with clinical care and strategic breeding, these horses had never once tasted the wild winds of the steppe or felt the sun without shelter. Now they were about to be released into one of Asia's harshest landscapes, not as museum pieces, but as rightful heirs to an ancient way of life. There were no tranquilizers, no ropes, and no halters. All of that had been left behind at base camp. This moment, later called Release Zero, was to be dictated by instinct alone. At the threshold of the open desert, the lead stallion hesitated, sniffing the air. His ears twitched. Then, suddenly, he broke into a gallop, hooves pounding against gravel. Dust rose behind him like a curtain falling. One by one, the rest followed. Silent, powerful, unchained. Within moments, they had disappeared over a low ridge. No one chased. There were no drones, no trackers hovering overhead. Just silence. For 3 days, there was no sign of them. Then, finally, a rented Y-12 turboprop aircraft flying overhead picked up a signal, 60 kilometers southeast of the release site. The horses had settled near a dry arroyo, but that wasn't what stunned the scientists. They had discovered an uncharted spring, one so obscure even the most seasoned rangers had never recorded it. In just 72 hours, these animals, once removed from every natural challenge, had found water in a land known for its scarcity. This was the turning point. From that moment, it was clear the desert no longer belonged to the rangers or researchers. It belonged to the horses. In the weeks that followed, they began behaving just as their wild ancestors once did. Young stallions broke away from family bands, forming tight bachelor groups. 9 weeks after release, rangers observed a powerful behavioral milestone, two males engaging in a dominance display. Ears pinned, nostrils flared, bodies heaving, yet there was no violence, just ritual squeals and posturing. It wasn't a fight. It was communication. A structure was forming naturally, without any human script. This wasn't a one-time event. It was the start of something bigger. In 2004, 10 more horses were released. In 2008, 18 more. And in May 2024, another group of 18 was set free near the Dur Conservation Station, bringing the total released in Xinjiang to 146. And they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Even during punishing winters, their body condition remained solid. On the Henneke body condition scale, which ranges from 1 emaciated to 9 obese, most horses averaged a healthy 3.5. Better, in fact, than many domestic horses on ranches. Their home range expanded dramatically. From the initial 120 square kilometers, the horses eventually spread across more than 660 by 2007. They weren't aimlessly wandering. They were following green-ups, short-lived bursts of fresh vegetation brought on by desert rains. And every midsummer, like clockwork, they returned to known watering sites. But not every moment was a success story. 2 mares died after accidentally ingesting plastic feed bags carried in by the wind from a nearby camel encampment. It was a hard reminder that even in the most protected settings, modern human waste can reach the wild. The reserve responded swiftly, banning all disposable sacks within its borders. Other moments brought even tougher decisions. One stallion stepped into a gopher hole and broke its leg. Rangers faced a painful choice: intervene and shatter the project's commitment to wild integrity, or step back and let nature take its course. They chose the latter. The horse was tracked limping for months before vanishing from satellite view. His fate remains unknown, but what he represented remains clear. Freedom isn't safe, and wildness comes with real risks. Word of the project spread quickly. The reserve introduced a strict visitor cap, only 400 guests allowed per year. Tickets vanished almost instantly. Visitors were shuttled by electric buses to a single raised viewing blind. From there, they scanned the horizon through telescopes. Even a glimpse of a foal, wobbling on unsteady legs, barely visible 300 meters away, was enough to bring an entire group to silent awe. Some wept, others whispered. Everyone felt it. Media headlines, of course, leaned into the drama. Extinct horses returned to China's desert. But the truth ran deeper than any headline could capture. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about science, strategy, and survival. It was about decades of breeding decisions, genetic tracking, and ecological modeling. Recruitment, the birth and survival of young, held steady at 15%. Herd structures became increasingly stable. Genetic diversity remained strong thanks to timely introductions from the Jimsar Breeding Center. And somewhere out there, under the blazing sun and between patches of windswept grass, hoofprints carved the sand, not just as signs of presence, but as proof that what was once thought extinct now walks again. And what if those fading hoofprints weren't just tracks, but living proof of an extinction reversed? Stay with us to discover more. What ancient DNA revealed about the last wild horse. In 2018, the world of conservation science was jolted by a discovery that changed how we see one of Earth's most iconic animals. Evolutionary biologist Ludovic Orlando and his international research team released findings that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. After analyzing the DNA from 42 ancient horse skeletons and comparing them with modern Przewalski's horses from China, Mongolia, and Europe, the results turned a long-held belief upside down. For decades, Przewalski's horses, sometimes called taki or spirit horses, were thought to be the last truly wild horses still roaming the planet. Unlike domesticated horses, they were believed to have never been tamed, never ridden, never altered by humans. But the DNA told a different story. Orlando's study found that these horses didn't descend from an untouched wild line. Instead, they came from animals first domesticated by the Botai people in what is now northern Kazakhstan over 5,000 years ago. It wasn't just a footnote in the history of horses, it was a genetic rewrite. The so-called wild horses were, in fact, feral descendants of some of the first horses ever trained and kept by humans. As expected, the media headlines exploded. Some called it a scandal. Others feared it would undermine conservation funding and weaken the case for protecting Przewalski's horses at all. If they weren't wild, were they still worth saving? But for those working on the ground, in labs, on reserves, and inside breeding programs, the discovery wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a deeper question. Does being wild only mean being genetically untouched? Or is wildness also about behavior, resilience, and a species' role in its ecosystem? The International Union for Conservation of Nature didn't hesitate. Rather than backing away, they kept Przewalski's horses on the red list of threatened species, stressing the need for more research and urging conservationists to focus on ecological function and adaptation, not just ancestry. China's scientific institutions took that message seriously. At the Xinjiang University Genomics Center, researchers dug into the DNA of free-ranging Przewalski's horses living in the rugged Kalamaili Nature Reserve. They started sequencing entire chromosomes, looking for patterns of strength, vulnerability, and diversity. The results were better than anyone hoped. The nucleotide diversity score, a genetic measure of how many different gene variants exist, came in at 0.25. That's impressive for any species, and it rivals what's seen in truly wild zebras and even beats out some domestic dog breeds. Just as importantly, when scientists examined the horse's mitochondrial DNA, they found 6 distinct maternal lines. This proved that the early breeding programs had done something right. They hadn't depended too heavily on just 1 or 2 founding mares. Genetic bottleneck avoided. But survival in the desert isn't just about having different genes. It's about having the right ones. That's where the immune system came in. Desert horses constantly battle tiny enemies, ticks, sandflies, and blood-borne parasites like pyroplasmosis. The body's defense against such threats is managed by a set of genes called the major histocompatibility complex, or major histocompatibility complex. Most domestic horses carry 8 or fewer major histocompatibility complex alleles, but the Kalamaili herd carried 12. That's a big deal. It gives them a wider range of immune responses, meaning they're better equipped to survive infections that could cripple or kill less adapted animals. And the surprises didn't stop there. Genetics isn't only about disease resistance. It's also deeply tied to how animals digest and extract nutrients, especially in a landscape where food is scarce and survival depends on making the most of every blade of grass. But what else did their genetic code reveal beyond disease resistance? The answer might surprise you. So, what do you think? Should we bring back extinct animals and let them roam the wild again? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more eye-opening stories.